In life's darkest moments, heroes come in the most unexpected forms. When Mark witnessed a thin, battle-scarred stray dog struggling with a mysterious sack twice its size, he never imagined he was about to uncover a story of loyalty that would change multiple lives forever. What secret was this determined dog protecting deep in those woods? The aftermath of nature's fury lay scattered across Mark's yard, broken branches, overturned furniture, and debris carried from who knows where. His muscles ached as he leaned on his rake, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cooling air. That's when he saw it, a flash of movement at the forest's edge that didn't belong. A dog. But not just any dog. This wasn't someone's pampered pet that had escaped during the chaos. No, this creature bore the unmistakable marks of a hard life. Patches of fur missing, revealing scars beneath, ribs visible despite the thick coat that remained. Yet there was something dignified in how it moved, something purposeful. Its eyes caught Mark's attention first, amber, intelligent, almost human in their focus. The dog had paused, seemingly aware of being watched, its gaze meeting Mark's across the distance. Between its jaws was the corner of what appeared to be a burlap sack, dragging behind it like an anchor, leaving a serpentine trail in the mud. "Hey there," Mark called softly, but the dog flinched at his voice. The animal adjusted its grip on the sack, which bulged with mysterious contents. Whatever was inside looked heavy, too heavy for an animal in this condition. Every few steps, the dog would pause, readjust its hold, and continue with a determination that seemed almost desperate. What could be so important that this starving creature would expend such precious energy? Food? Unlikely, the shape was all wrong. A possession? But what would a stray value enough to drag through a storm-ravaged forest? Mark watched as the dog disappeared between the trees, the sack catching momentarily on a fallen branch before being yanked free with renewed effort. The forest seemed to swallow both dog and burden whole. He should go inside. The darkening sky promised another downpour soon. The distant rumble of thunder confirmed it, another storm front approaching. His warm, dry house beckoned just yards away. "This isn't your problem," he muttered to himself. And yet, something about those eyes. Something about that determination. It nagged at him like a splinter under skin, impossible to ignore once noticed. Mark glanced back at his house, safety, comfort, rationality, then toward the forest, where the dog's muddy paw prints formed a wavering path between the trees. Fine droplets of rain began to pepper his face, nature's gentle warning of what was to come. "I must be losing my mind," he whispered, setting his rake against the porch and zipping his jacket higher. The first steps into the forest felt like crossing an invisible threshold. The temperature dropped immediately under the canopy of trees, sunlight filtering through in weak, scattered beams. The dog's trail was clear enough, not just paw prints now, but the distinctive drag marks of the sack, carving a continuous line through fallen leaves and mud. The trees grew denser with each step, branches interlacing overhead, filtering out what little light remained in the storm-darkened sky. The forest had its own sounds, the creaking of trees, the occasional scurry of unseen creatures, and now, the growing intensity of rain striking leaves above. How far had the dog gone? And more importantly, why? What drove an animal in such condition to such effort? Thunder cracked overhead, closer now, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. The rain began to penetrate the canopy, fat drops finding their way through the leaves to strike his face, his shoulders. Common sense screamed at him to turn back. Yet those eyes, that desperate determination, they pulled him forward like an invisible tether. Mark pushed through a thick tangle of brush, branches clutching at his clothes like grasping fingers. When he emerged on the other side, the path led deeper, darker, toward a part of the forest he'd never explored despite living beside it for years. A sudden chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the rain or wind. The sense that he was crossing into something unknown, something he couldn't turn back from once discovered. What awaited him in those woods? What secret was this determined dog protecting or pursuing? The answer lay somewhere ahead in the gathering darkness, and whatever it was, Mark knew with absolute certainty it would change everything. The forest seemed to close in around Mark as he ventured deeper. What had started as a clear trail now fragmented into scattered paw prints that disappeared and reappeared between patches of sodden leaves and mud. Rain seeped through his jacket, cold droplets finding their way down his neck and spine with each gust of wind. "This is insane," he muttered, his breath visible in the cooling air. Following a stray dog into the woods during a storm? He paused, listening. The sound of the rain muffled everything else, creating a curtain of white noise that seemed to isolate him completely. For a moment, Mark felt entirely alone in the world, just him, the ancient trees, and the fading trail of a mysterious dog with its burden. The first time he nearly turned back was when the trail disappeared completely at a small creek, swollen with rainwater and rushing with newfound power. Mark stood at its edge, scanning the opposite bank for any sign of the dog's passage. Nothing. "That's it," he said aloud, as if needing to hear a human voice in the growing isolation. "This is where common sense wins." But just as he turned to retrace his steps, a flash of movement caught his eye downstream, a disruption in the mud of the opposite bank that looked suspiciously like a paw print. The dog had crossed elsewhere. Thunder cracked overhead, closer now, sending vibrations through the ground beneath his feet. The storm was intensifying, following him like a predator. The second time he nearly abandoned his pursuit came when briars tore at his jeans, drawing blood from his shin. The sudden, sharp pain made him curse aloud. What was he doing out here? What could possibly be worth this? Yet something, curiosity, concern, or perhaps something deeper he couldn't name, drove him forward, one reluctant step after another. Then suddenly, the dense tangle of vegetation gave way. Mark stumbled forward, nearly falling as the resistance disappeared without warning. He found himself standing in what had once been a dirt road, two parallel ruts now overgrown with weeds but still visible in the fading light. Tire tracks, ancient and rarely used, stretched ahead through the trees. Mark's pulse quickened. These tracks meant civilization, or at least what remained of it. He followed them with renewed purpose, his pace quickening despite the exhaustion settling into his legs. The trees thinned just enough to create a small clearing, and there it stood, a hunting cabin, weathered by decades of seasons. Its log walls had darkened with age, and part of the roof had collapsed inward like a chest caved from impact. A single window reflected the gray light, its glass somehow intact despite the structure's general decay. But what made Mark freeze in his tracks was not the cabin itself but the fresh drag marks in the mud. The unmistakable trail left by the sack. They led directly to the cabin's crooked front door, which hung slightly ajar. The rain eased momentarily, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. In that sudden quiet, Mark heard it, voices. Faint, just at the edge of perception, but unmistakably human. One voice or two? He couldn't tell. The words were indistinct, muffled by the walls of the cabin and the distance between them. Mark's heart pounded against his ribs. The implications raced through his mind like scattered puzzle pieces. Was someone living in this forgotten place? Was someone in trouble? Had the dog stolen something valuable from a nearby property? Or was this something far more complex, a story with layers he couldn't yet imagine? He approached cautiously, each step deliberate, testing the ground for twigs that might snap and announce his presence. The cabin loomed larger with each step, its shadow stretching toward him like reaching fingers despite the diffuse, cloudy light. 20 feet from the porch. 15. 10. The weathered steps creaked under the weight of a phantom. Wind? Or something moving inside? As Mark's foot touched the first rotting step, a blur of motion erupted from beneath the porch. The dog, the same weather-beaten mutt, materialized as if conjured from the shadows. It planted itself firmly between Mark and the door, its stance wide and defensive. In the direct confrontation, Mark could now see details he'd missed at a distance. The dog was older than he'd first thought, gray flecking its muzzle. One ear was partially missing, testifying to old battles. But most striking were those eyes, intelligent, evaluating, uncannily human in their assessment. A low growl rumbled from the dog's chest, vibrating through the space between them. It wasn't loud, but it carried unmistakable meaning. Come no closer. The dog's hackles rose along its spine, but something seemed off about its aggression. There was no frothing, no bared teeth, just a clear warning. This wasn't blind aggression but calculated protection. Behind the dog, the voices inside fell silent. Had they heard the growl? Were they aware of Mark's presence now? The dog didn't waver, its eyes locked on Mark's. In that moment of tense standoff, a strange understanding passed between men and animal. The dog wasn't protecting itself. It was protecting whatever, or whoever, was inside that cabin. And in that realization, Mark felt the world tilt slightly beneath his feet. Whatever secret lay behind that weathered door was something this loyal, determined creature had deemed worth every ounce of its remaining strength to safeguard. The rain began again, heavier now, drumming on the partially collapsed roof. Water dripped through the broken sections, creating a strange, discordant music that seemed to match the tension of the moment. What mystery waited inside? What connection bound this fierce protector to whatever it guarded? And more importantly, would Mark be welcomed as savior or viewed as threat when that door finally opened? The answer hung suspended in the rain-soaked air between them, as the dog's growl deepened and footsteps approached the door from within. The standoff stretched into seconds that felt like hours. Rain drummed against Mark's shoulders, each drop another beat in the percussion of tension between men and dog. Those amber eyes never wavered, never blinked, a guardian whose loyalty transcended his physical condition. Mark's throat tightened. One wrong move might escalate this confrontation. Yet something told him that violence wasn't the answer, wasn't what either of them wanted. "Hello." His voice cracked slightly, hoarse from exertion and anxiety. "Is anyone there?" The words hung in the damp air, seemingly absorbed by the fog that had begun to form around the cabin's edges. Mark remained perfectly still, pinned in place by the dog's unwavering stare. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, a subtle change. Somewhere behind that weathered door, floorboards creaked. The sound of shuffling. Movement. The dog's ears twitched but its gaze never left Mark's face. Time suspended itself as the door's hinges protested with a long, haunting groan. It opened just a crack at first, darkness visible within. Then wider, revealing nothing but shadow. Until suddenly, there he was. An old man stood in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by what must have been candlelight or a lantern from within. He was painfully thin, his clothes hanging from his frame like forgotten laundry on a line. A beard, more gray than white, cascaded down his chest, unkempt but somehow dignified. His hands, spotted with age and work, trembled slightly as they gripped the doorframe for support. But it was his eyes that captivated Mark. Deep set beneath a heavy brow, they carried a clarity that seemed almost out of place in his weathered face. Eyes that had seen too much. Eyes that had stopped expecting to see anything new. "Rex brought another one, did he?" The words emerged as a whisper, so quiet that Mark nearly missed them beneath the patter of rain. The old man's voice had the quality of something long and used, rough edges, like a tool recovered from a forgotten toolbox. "Another one?" The phrase ignited questions in Mark's mind, but before he could voice any of them, the dog, Rex, underwent a transformation so sudden it seemed almost magical. The hackles lowered. The growl subsided. The defensive posture melted away. In its place stood not a fierce guardian, but a devoted companion, tail sweeping a slow arc through the rain-soaked air. Rex turned, trotting back toward the sack he'd abandoned during his defensive stand, gripping the corner of the burlap in his mouth once more. Mark watched in astonishment as the dog dragged the heavy burden toward the old man with renewed purpose, not the desperation of before, but the pride of a provider returning home successful from the hunt. The old man's face softened, lines rearranging themselves from wariness into something approaching wonder. Let's see what you've found this time, old friend. Gnarled fingers, joints swollen with arthritis, worked at the crude knot securing the sack. As it loosened and the contents spilled partially onto the porch, Mark's confusion transformed into understanding, a revelation that made his breath catch in his throat. Food scraps, still relatively fresh. A can of beans, its label water-stained but intact. A partial loaf of bread in plastic, protected from the elements. A bottle of water. A small jar of peanut butter. Even a package of batteries, somehow untouched by water damage. All items that would have been scattered from homes during the storm. All items that someone, something, with intelligence and purpose had selectively gathered. The storm was a good one, wasn't it, Rex? The old man's voice carried a note of reverence as he gently sorted through the items. You always know just what to bring. He looked up then, catching Mark's stunned expression, a ghost of a smile forming beneath the wild beard. He's been keeping me alive for 3 winters now, the man explained, one hand moving to rest on Rex's damp head. The touch between them spoke volumes, a connection forged in survival and mutual need. Name's Henry. Haven't had a visitor in, well, I've stopped counting. The casual admission struck Mark with unexpected force. 3 winters. How many days was that? How many storms? How many solo journeys had this loyal creature made, seeking not his own survival but that of the frail men before him? Rain continued to fall around them, but Mark barely noticed anymore. He was transfixed by the tableau before him, by the quiet dignity of Henry's poverty, by the noble purpose that had driven Rex through pain and exhaustion, by the bond between them that defied simple explanation. You look like you've seen a ghost, son, Henry observed, his head tilting slightly. Maybe you have. Most folks around here think I'm long dead. Prefer it that way, truth be told. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, freezing it in stark relief. The collapsing cabin, the elderly hermit, the devoted dog, the scavenged treasures. In that brief, electric moment, Mark caught a glimpse of something he hadn't seen in years, perhaps had never truly seen at all. Raw, unvarnished humanity, stripped of pretense, reduced to its most elemental form. Survival. Connection. Purpose. Would you like to come in? Henry asked, gesturing with a trembling hand toward the dark interior. Storm's getting worse. And Rex seems to think you're worth trusting, which means something. He's a better judge of character than most people I've known. The invitation hung between them, simple yet profound. Mark stood at a crossroads, not just between shelter and storm, but between continuing his comfortable, isolated existence and stepping into a story far more complex than he could have imagined when he first spotted that determined dog at the forest's edge. What secrets did this cabin hold? What had driven this man to such solitude? And how had fate conspired to bring these 3 souls together on this storm-racked evening? The answers awaited beyond that weathered threshold, in the candlelit shadows of a forgotten life, if Mark had the courage to cross over and discover them. Inside the dim cabin, Mark took in the scene, makeshift shelves, a worn-out bed, a cast-iron stove barely keeping the place warm. Everything screamed survival. Henry struggled to unpack the sack, his hands trembling from age and exhaustion. Mark knelt beside him. Let me help. Henry hesitated. When was the last time someone offered? Finally, he nodded. As they sorted the supplies, Mark's curiosity grew. How did you train Rex to do this? Henry let out a rough chuckle. I didn't. He just figured it out. A beat of silence. Then, Henry spoke again, voice lower. Vietnam. 1968, came back different. Had a family once, lost them in '82. Couldn't face people after that. Been here ever since. Mark's eyes flicked to a faded photograph on the wall, a woman and child, frozen in time. Henry exhaled. 2 years ago, my legs started failing. I figured that was it for me. Then Rex showed up. At the sound of his name, the dog lifted his head. Didn't expect him to stay. But then, he started bringing things home. First small stuff, gloves, plastic containers. Then food. A whole sandwich one day, still wrapped. Mark's stomach tightened. You mean, he's been feeding you? Henry nodded. Everything here, Rex brought it. Every bit of food, every supply. And somehow, he just knows where to go. Henry gestured to a crude map pinned to the wall. Rex patted over and placed his paw on different spots. Mark's breath caught. Marks where he finds things? Henry's eyes gleamed. Smartest soul I've ever known. And kinder than most people. A loud crack from above made them both jump. A ceiling beam groaned under the weight of the storm. A fresh leak dripped near Henry's bed. Rex stood, tense, watching the ceiling. Mark felt the weight of it all, the dog's relentless effort, the collapsing cabin, the fragile life Henry was clinging to. He turned to Henry. You can stay here. Henry met his gaze, resignation flickering in his eyes. I know. Mark swallowed hard, feeling the decision settle on his shoulders. He couldn't walk away. Not from this. Not from them. 3 days later, Mark's truck rumbled down the muddy path, toolbox rattling, a box of groceries and medications beside him. He hadn't planned on coming back. He told himself calling local services was enough. But here he was. As the cabin came into view, Rex emerged from the shadows, tail wagging cautiously. Hey, boy, Mark murmured, stepping out. Brought some things for your friend. Rex trotted to the door, looking back, a silent invitation. That visit became another. Then another. Each time, Mark brought supplies, repaired what he could. Henry resisted at first. Don't need charity. Not charity, Mark replied. Just being a neighbor. Bit by bit, Henry's story surfaced. Vietnam, lost family, decades of self-imposed exile. One evening, Mark noticed a half-written letter on Henry's table. Been trying, Henry admitted. How do you tell someone you disappeared for 40 years? Mark didn't answer. But that night, he made a decision. The search took weeks. Public records, dead ends, then a name, Sarah Williams, Columbus, Ohio. He sent an email, I may have information about your father. Her reply came fast, my father died in 1985. No, Mark wrote back. He didn't. 2 days later, his phone rang. A hesitant voice. Tell me everything. When Sarah arrived, Mark waited at the clearing. She stepped from her car, middle-aged, her father's eyes staring back at him. He's nervous, Mark warned. 40 years, she whispered. I've counted every one. Rex appeared from the trees, assessing her. After a moment, he turned toward the cabin, glancing back, an approval, an invitation. Inside, Henry stood frozen in the doorway. Silence stretched. Then, cautiously, he stepped forward. A daughter's breath hitched. Hands trembled, reaching across decades. Tears fell. Rex watched from the threshold, guardian, witness, bridge. Healing wasn't instant. Trust, once broken, takes time. But Sarah returned, bringing photo albums of a life Henry had missed. Weddings, grandchildren, moments lost. One afternoon, she said softly, they want to meet you. The whole family. Fear flickered in Henry's eyes. I don't know if I can. She squeezed his hand. You don't have to do it alone. Rex lifted his head, eyes moving between them, silent reassurance. 3 months after Mark followed a dog into the woods, Henry took his first steps out. In Sarah's driveway, 3 children, his grandchildren, waited on the porch. Beside them, her husband, patient and kind. Henry hesitated. Then, gripping his cane and Rex's fur for courage, he stepped forward. The porch light glowed behind them as the door opened, welcoming him inside. 6 months later, Mark pulled into Sarah's driveway. The old garage, now Henry's guest house, was lit. Through the window, he saw them, Henry in a chair, his youngest grandchild on his knee, Rex at his feet. On the wall hung 2 photographs, one old and faded, Henry with his wife and infant daughter. Beside it, a new one, Henry, Sarah, her family, and Rex at the center, his watchful eyes seeming to say, *, this is what loyalty builds. This is what never giving up creates. *. Mark hesitated at the door, listening to Henry's voice, stronger now, sharing stories of war, construction sites, and a stray dog who refused to let him fade away. Some heroes wear capes. Others have 4 legs, fierce hearts, and a loyalty that defies explanation. Has an animal ever led you somewhere unexpected, somewhere you never knew you needed to be? Share your story in the comments. And subscribe for more tales of incredible animal heroes. Because sometimes, the most human among us aren't human at all.